The day I came back, the lock clicked shut in my face. It was not a polite sound, not an accident of timing. It was deliberate, heavy, final. The kind of click that tells you without words, you don't belong here anymore. I stood there on the porch of my childhood home, my hand still resting on the knob, a bag of tools slung over my shoulder. The brass knob was colder than it should have been, the way metal gets when it doesn't recognize you anymore. I pulled my hand back slowly, watching the light catch on the newly polished keyhole. The lock was different. It gleamed. Someone had put money into it, not me. For a moment, the porch itself seemed to lean away from me, boards creaking under my boots as though they, too, were strangers now. The smell of autumn leaves was thick in the air, and from somewhere inside, I caught the faintest trace of furniture polish and fresh paint scents that didn't belong to me. Then I heard it. Footsteps inside. Slow, casual, and confident. A man's cough. And then a voice I knew better than I wanted to admit. Guess he'll figure it out sooner or later. My younger brother's voice floated through the thin walls. The words weren't meant for me to hear, but I did. I always did. That's the curse of being the quiet one in a family full of noise. You catch every careless phrase. I didn't knock. I didn't shout. I didn't bang on the door like a desperate fool. I just stood there, jaw tight, the chill seeping into my bones. My childhood home, the house I patched after storms, painted after winters, bled into when nails slipped no longer mine. I turned away slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel of the driveway. The maple tree by the front yard bent its branches in the wind. The same tree I'd climbed 100 times as a boy. I looked up at it, almost expecting the rope swing to still be hanging there. It wasn't. My brother must have cut it down years ago, erased even the shadow of my childhood. That night, I lay in the rented room I'd been keeping above the hardware store. One room, small stove, creaky bed. I wasn't a rich man, never cared to be. My wealth was in calloused hands, in the wood I shaped, in the places I kept standing. And above all, in that house, the last breath of my parents, the archive of every memory that mattered. I thought of my mother's hands, cracked and red from washing. My father's laugh by the fireplace when the snow piled too high to leave the property. The corner of the living room where I'd carved my initials into the baseboard at age 12, hidden behind a bookshelf. My brother David was 10 years younger than me. When our parents died, I was 38, already bent with work, already tired. David was 28, still restless, chasing after women and money, never showing up when it was time to repair the roof or shovel the driveway. It was me who kept the house alive. I canceled trips, turned down jobs, spent long nights patching leaks while David was out at bars bragging about a family place he never lifted a hammer to maintain. For years, I carried it all. Because I thought blood mattered. Because I thought family remembered. But family forgets. The day of the lock was just the final insult. The betrayal had been brewing for years. I just refused to see it. I remembered the phone call 3 months earlier. You don't need to worry about the property taxes anymore, David had said, his voice smooth with false generosity. I've got it handled. I'd hesitated. I've always paid them. Why change it now? You're getting older, Rich. Let me take some of the weight off your shoulders. It had sounded like kindness, but even then, something in the back of my head whispered caution. I ignored it. I wanted to believe my brother finally cared, finally understood what the house meant. I should have known better. Now, standing locked out, the truth was as sharp as the November air. David had shifted the papers, maybe just the mailing address, maybe more. And now he stood inside, feet on the same floorboards I once polished, acting as though I'd never existed. I kept my silence, not out of weakness, out of instinct. My father used to tell me, when a man underestimates you, don't correct him. Let him walk right into his own downfall. That night, I sharpened a pencil and opened an old notebook. I wrote down dates, numbers, fragments of memory, property taxes, utility bills, repairs I'd logged over decades. Every receipt I had, every photo, every check with my signature, because I knew this wasn't about just a house. This was about erasure, about being written out of the story of my own life. The days that followed were quiet but heavy. I walked past the house often, never up to the porch again, just close enough to see. The curtains were different cheap lace, not the ones my mother sewed. David's car sat smugly in the driveway, a new dent in the fender. Once, I saw him on the porch, laughing with a woman who looked too young for him. He leaned against the railing I had rebuilt one summer after it rotted, his hand resting exactly where mine had hammered the new boards in. She laughed, tossing her hair, and he said something loud enough for the whole block. This place is mine now. Always should have been. The words carried across the yard like a slap. My chest burned, but my face stayed calm. I kept walking. What no one saw was how carefully I started collecting. At the courthouse, I sat quietly at a long wooden table, the smell of dust and old ink filling the air. Clerks barely noticed me, just an older man flipping through records. I traced the line of deeds, mortgages, wills. My parents' signatures were there, shaky but proud. My own name appeared on tax records year after year. And then a gap. 3 months ago, the mail address changed. The payer's name shifted. David's handwriting, sloppy and hurried, tried to overwrite mine. But paper doesn't forget. Paper keeps ghosts alive. I photocopied everything, paid cash for every page, slid them into a binder thick enough to break a shelf. At night, I dreamed of the house. Not in anger, not in rage, but in silence. Empty rooms, waiting. My mother's voice humming in the kitchen. The smell of cedar from the attic where I stored my tools. And each morning I woke with the same thought. He thinks changing a lock erases me. But I know doors better than he does. I've built them, repaired them, held their weight in my hands. Locks are nothing compared to deeds. The last time I saw David that season, he didn't see me. He was standing in the yard, talking to a neighbor. His laugh was sharp, arrogant. He pointed at the house like a trophy. My brother was always too sentimental, couldn't let go, but I made it official. This place is mine. The neighbor nodded politely, but her eyes flicked toward the sidewalk where I stood, just out of sight. She saw me. She knew, but she said nothing. People rarely do. I walked on, my heart steady, my breath calm. Each word he spoke was a nail, not in my coffin, but in his, because I wasn't locked out anymore. I was already inside, in the only place that mattered. The paperwork, the history, the truth. That winter, I kept my silence. Snow piled against my rented room's window, the radiator groaning, the town settling into its holiday routines. And I kept writing. Every detail, every receipt, every memory. I thought of my father again, the way he'd pause before driving a nail. Measure twice, cut once. He'd told me patience wasn't weakness. It was strength waiting for its moment. David thought he had won. He thought locks and keys were enough. But locks are for doors. Deeds are for men. And in my pocket, I still carried the old brass key to the house worn, bent, scratched by years of use. It didn't open the new lock, no. But it wasn't meant to anymore. It was a reminder. That I wasn't done. That this wasn't over. That some victories are quiet, slow, and sharper than any slammed door. I did not grow into silence. I learned it beside hissing kettles and floorboards that complained when the cold slid under the door. Before the house became a battleground of paper, it was a workshop for patience. My father taught me the language of wood. Knots that resist, grain that persuades, edges that bruise if you hurry them. He said houses remember the hands that touch them. Maybe that is why I trusted the walls to know me long after my brother began speaking as if I had never lived there at all. The second winter after our mother died, the furnace coughed itself lame the week before Christmas. David said he would look into it, which meant he would ask a friend to ask a cousin to forget by New Year's. I carried 2 old space heaters up from the basement, cords snaking along the hallway like cats that know the route better than I do. All night I fed the rooms a thin warmth and listened to pipes knock their teeth together. At dawn I bought an igniter, knelt, and coaxed the flame back like an apology. The house sighed when the vents woke, the way a body sighs when pain loosens a notch. That is the shape of memory here. Not grand scenes, but small fixes that kept everything ordinary. I replaced a length of gutter a storm had bent into a twisted rib. I patched plaster above the stair landing where water had painted a map of a country that never existed. I tightened the banister posts one by one, slipping washers into loose joints so the rail would hold the weight of a child who might rush down on some Sunday morning we were still good at pretending to have. I oiled the hinge that always squealed at dawn because my mother liked to sleep late when the snow came. When my father's left hand lost its strength, he refused to stop. He cradled a chisel in his right like a priest, with a chalice, and pretended the other hand was merely resting. After dinner, we worked in the garage over a length of cherry meant for a kneeler. The place smelled of sawdust and cool oil. If I closed my eyes, I could navigate it by touch and scent alone. Pegboard rough under my fingertips, the smooth belly of the planer, the tiny rattle of screws in a jar. We didn't speak much. The wood did. My father's breath came short, then steadied, then shortened again. We learned to take breaks without calling them surrender. I gave up a promotion once, a foreman's job restoring warehouses along the river. The boss said I had the temperament to keep men from wasting a day. I told him my parents needed rides to appointments, and the roof would not last to another thaw. He said I could hire someone. I looked at his soft nails and told him roofs sleep easier when they know the hands above them. He laughed. I did not. I came home and pried up shingles under a sky the color of dishwater. Tar softened just enough to smell like burned sugar. The ridgeline finally straightened after 3 days of stubborn work. No one congratulated the house for holding. David visited that week with a girlfriend whose perfume argued with the smell of tar. He stretched on the couch and announced he had a lead on a brokerage job in the city. He spoke about square footage and proximity to where things happen, and never once lifted his eyes to the roof I had coaxed true. On his way out, he said, "Rich, you're good at the domestic stuff. Wish I had your patience." He did not say thank you. People who live in a hurry don't notice the men who make hurrying possible. There is one memory I do not polish because it already shines the way pain does. Mother's final week was winter clear, the air outside like glass. She wanted to sleep in the front room so she could hear cars roll by and imagine being a neighbor again. I moved the bed there and taped plastic over the oldest window. At 3 in the morning, I woke to iodine and lemon on the air and the faintest whimper of wind under the sash. She asked for water, took a single sip, and held my wrist the way people hold a railing on dark stairs. "Be kind," she whispered. The words weighed more than they sounded. Then she slept. In the morning, I made pancakes and overcooked them, and the kitchen smelled like a burned attempt at love. She managed half of one and smiled anyway. If kindness can be measured, it looks like a task done badly but steadily until it is done right. The will came later, typed by a lawyer who preferred firm nouns to soft verbs. The house, he wrote, would pass to both sons, with the expectation that reasonable accommodation shall be made for occupancy and maintenance by the party most involved in caretaking. It trusted good faith more than it should. We did not have money for a fancier instrument with sealed envelopes and trustees. We had a family and a roof, and we believed that was enough. The first year after the funeral proved us naive. The 5th proved us unlucky. The 10th proved us stubborn. I lent David money small sums at first, then what any man with sense would call too much. He called it bridge cash, a phrase that sounds sturdy until you realize a bridge to nowhere still swallows your steps. Once I sold my pickup and bought an older, meaner truck that roared itself awake like an insult. The buyer counted bills on the hood while geese stitched a gray underline across the sky. I used the money to catch the taxes before the penalty turned from nuisance to habit. David promised repayment on Friday, then the Friday after, then the Friday that never learned its name. The first time I felt erased was not the day of the new lock. It was the slow decline of courtesy. David stopped knocking when he came by. He started walking in, then opening my refrigerator, then leaving with a 6-pack because we share this place, right? He brought friends who admired the crown molding I had nursed back from cracked paint and introduced it as original. Somehow it survived, as if restoration were a miracle that fell from the rafters. I began to feel like a tenant whose lease contained a joke in every clause. Our father died a year later. We buried him on the hill he used to mow himself when the caretaker got careless. The priest said kind words. I heard the wind comb the grass. That night, I sat in the garage with the unfinished kneeler and ran a finger along the edge we had meant to soften. The grain looked like the map my mother's water stain had once made curves of a place you cannot find again. David called from a bar and said he would handle the obituary. He spelled our father's middle name wrong. I corrected it and said nothing else. The house remained loyal. That's the word I use when I talk to myself because no one else would understand. In July, the basement took on water after a thunderhead parked above us. I set up fans, lifted boxes onto cinder blocks, and squeeged until my lower back sang a bad song. A family album had swollen with a memory of rain. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on a towel like a patient waiting for stitches. I separated photographs one by one. My mother at a picnic in a dress with tiny flowers. My father in a wool cap, white grin bright in winter. 2 boys on a rope, swing under the maple, one small enough to fit inside the other's shadow. People told me the place was too much for one man. They said sell, buy a square of lawn and a kitchen with a countertop that did not remember so many elbows. But reason does not mow the yard the morning after a bad dream, counting neat passes until your breathing matches the lines. Reason does not patch the porch step because the squeak there is the exact pitch you associate with your father's return from a walk. The house had become a book I had read too often to stop at the middle, even when the sentences hurt. What David did finally was not original. Most betrayals aren't. He stood in the echo of old promises and made a new one to himself. Possession is 9/10 of nerve. He began receiving mail at the house when I was away on a job. He told the bank he was the point of contact. He changed the tone with which he spoke to neighbors from visitor to host. By the time he installed the new lock, he was putting a period at the end of a sentence he had been drafting for years, confident I would accept the grammar. If there was rage in me, it took the shape of focus. I started walking the town like a man learning his own history from the outside. I visited the clerk who had served 6 administrations and knew everyone whose name had ever been misspelled on a record. She wore a cardigan the color of oatmeal and held the past like a careful stack of plates. When I asked for copies of the year I paid the tax early to catch the discount, she smiled because she remembered phoning me to tell me how much I'd saved. I added the records to a binder that grew heavy and sure. I went to the church office and asked to see the ledger for the roof fund. The secretary turned pages with the tenderness of a nurse checking a pulse. My name appeared in small hand 4 times at awkward amounts, 20 here, 30 there, the gifts of a man who calculates groceries around loyalty. David's name appeared once, a round number written in a confident pitch. Paper is a choir. You do not need a solo when the harmony is true. I did not gloat. I simply listened to the notes line up the way nails hold a beam. There were quiet witnesses people carried without knowing. Mrs. Klein across the street remembered the night I shoveled the drive so the ambulance could find us after my father fell. She remembered David arriving after the paramedics left, telling someone on the sidewalk that he had handled it. She wrote a single sentence on lined paper. Richard did the work you do for family. No court orders a neighbor's handwriting, but juries of conscience do. I put her note into the binder and felt the pages settle, a house finding its footing after a long wind. I looked through my own boxes and found a letter my father wrote after his stroke. The script leaned right like a man in a strong wind. Rich, it said, don't let the house feel alone. A building can die of loneliness. I did not know how to carry that sentence into a courtroom without tearing it, so I memorized it. Some evidence belongs under the ribs where stamps and seals cannot reach. I repeated the words walking home, matching them to the rhythm of my boots until they felt carved. One memory returned with a clarity that made my palms sting. Years earlier, a storm peeled the old screen door from its hinges like a scab. I laid it across sawhorses and sanded paint until the original wood woke under my hands. A boy from up the block wandered over and watched, thumb threaded through the torn hem of his sweatshirt. He asked why I didn't just buy a new door. Because this one knows our winters, I said. He nodded and biked away. The next week, I saw him help his grandmother carry groceries up her steps. Some repairs echo in people, not wood. Every sacrifice I made had the same logic. Keep the house kind. That does not mean keep it easy. Sometimes kindness is a hard discipline. I told David once, in the soft voice men reserve for foolish brothers, that he could treat the place like an asset if he wanted, but I would keep treating it like a relative. He said relatives cost more. He was right. I paid, and I paid. And I paid because expense is one of the few ways love becomes legible to people who do not speak its language. He learned only the cost. I learned the worth. Throughout the winter after the lock, the town held its usual pageants. Lights trembled along porches. Children shrieked in the snow and left their mittens where dogs found them. I walked everywhere and touched nothing. I was learning that restraint is a tool as sharp as any chisel. Each evening, I returned to my rented room and laid documents on the bedspread in careful grids like floor plans for a house no one else could see yet. My hands shook sometimes, not from fear but from stored energy finally choosing a direction. I am not a lawyer. I am a carpenter who reads contracts the way other men read grain. Follow the line, watch how the light lifts the surface, look for the place where a cut will split clean. What the will left ambiguous, the record clarified. What the record left murky, the habit of a lifetime explained. I was not building a case. I was building a narrative that happened to be true. Truth works slowly because it does not need to hurry. Patience is not passivity. It is momentum with its coat on. I thought often of my mother's instruction, be kind. Kindness now meant a sort of mercy that would not spare my brother the consequences of contempt. Mercy without consequence is a padlock on a door that should open. The house deserved better than more sentiment. It deserved to be held by the man who had already held it through freeze and thaw. If memory could not persuade David, paper would instruct him. If he would not hear me, he would hear the clerk who stamps years into the margin where ink grows permanent. On the last night of the year, I took the old brass key from my pocket and laid it on the nightstand. I pressed my thumb into the nick near its teeth where it once caught on a burr and cut me. The scar is a pale crescent near the base of my thumb. It itched, the way healed skin does when weather changes. I smiled because a body remembers what a mind edits. The key no longer needed to turn any lock. It only needed to remind me that doors exist to clarify who we are on either side. January arrived. The town scraped its driveways with tired shovels and scraped its conversations with tired theories. Families fight about houses, people said. They do. But houses also fight for families if you listen. In the courthouse lobby, I paused before the bulletin board crowded with lost dog notices, piano lesson flyers, and a poster for a coat drive. A corner of paper curled loose from a thumbtack. I pressed it back. The staple bit. Small anchors, small steadiness. Not every act needs applause. Some only need to hold. I carried my binder to the records window and asked for forms I had never said aloud before. The clerk slid them through the slot with the calm interest of someone passing salt across the table. "You'll want the registrar next," she said. "Back hall, third door." Her voice was gentle, as if she could hear the gear inside me finally engage. I thanked her and walked toward the door that would begin a different kind of maintenance done in ink. In silence, with the patience of a man who knows even a house must sometimes be rebuilt on paper. I did not look toward the square where the old maple stood above the roofline. I did not need to. I could see the place by feel, the exact number of steps from sidewalk to porch, the hollow spot in the second stair where years of feet had thinned the wood, the way noonlight found the banister and warmed it like a quiet hand. I walked forward and felt the floor under this new hallway answer me the way the house once did. Steady, ready, listening. The season of memory had done its work. It was time to speak in documents, not pleas. The courthouse smells like toner and winter coats. Heat whispers from floor vents that never learned the trick of reaching knees. I carry the binder tucked against my ribs, the way a man carries something that can't be dropped without losing more than paper. The clerk at records lifts her eyes and recognizes me, not my name yet, just the shape of a man who keeps coming back. She asks which year I want first. I tell her all of them, and she laughs softly, the harmless kind, before wheeling out a gray cart with history folded into manila. Chain of title reads like genealogy without birthdays. Deed to my parents, then a refinance when interest got friendly, then nothing for years but my tax receipts stapled to notices that would have turned sharp if I'd blinked. 3 months before the new lock, a change of mailing address. 2 weeks after that, an affidavit of occupancy and control signed by my brother in handwriting that staggers like it's leaving a bar. Not notarized correctly, the stamp half a kiss, the date crowded into the line reserved for county. Paper tells the truth even when it tries not to. I slide copies into my binder sleeves, the plastic crackling like small frost. On the last page of the affidavit, there's a line he didn't fill, the one where you list who else has a recorded interest. He left it blank, sure that silence would carry him across. I write a note to myself in pencil. Omissions don't erase obligations. Pencil makes a sound like careful rain. I look up to the microfilm reader where another man turns a crank and summons dead mortgages to life. The room hums. Paper memory feels louder than voices. When I step outside, the noon light has a tin quality. I sit on the cold stone balustrade and call a lawyer I once installed bookshelves for Rowan and Bell. 2 names that sounded like a hardware store until you heard them in court. The receptionist remembers my shelves. She offers me the Wednesday that people keep free for apologies. On Wednesday, I wear the clean shirt, the one that remembers interviews I turned down. The office is warm in a way money buys. Thick carpet, quiet doors, coffee that smells like the end of a good argument. Rowan is small, all bone and twine, with eyes that read sentences before you finish them. I spread my binder on her table the way a carpenter reveals joists under rotten floor. She does not hurry. She puts yellow flags in places my brother hoped were weeds. "Here," she says, tapping the blank line, "and here the notarization." This isn't fatal by itself, but the pattern tells a story a judge likes to hear. She asks about the will. I slide a copy forward. The phrase reasonable accommodation lifts its eyebrows at us. Judges hate poetry and wills. Rowan says, but they like evidence. You've got years of it. We talk strategies like men plan scaffolding, affidavits from neighbors, records of tax payments, photographs of repairs dated the way the sun dates a shadow. She recommends an action that is not loud but permanent. Quiet title. The phrase is exactly what I need. Title that does not shout, only endures. Will also file a notice of claim of interest, she adds, writing the words on her pad, each letter square. If he tries to refinance, your name will ring the bell. I ask about cost. She names a fee that sits heavy, then offers a plan. You built my shelves, she says. They've never sagged. I spend the afternoon walking to places where people remember in ink. The tax office is warm with stale coffee and old linoleum. Behind the counter sits a man with a mustache like a winter broom. When I ask for a ledger printout, he calls me by my last name and says he wondered when I'd come. We both look at the list, line after line with my check number next to property tax. Sometimes early, never late. 3 months ago, a new name appears exactly once, and even that payment is short by a late fee someone assumed would be forgiven by charm. Government doesn't forgive charm, it files it. At the bank, the teller prints copies of checks I wrote from years when money agreed to behave and years when it did not. On several, the memo line reads, house tax in my cramped hand. One says roof materials, another oil delivery. The ink has the faded authority of a bruise that healed right. I add them to the binder by date and write a small index on a yellow card, with the precision you use when placing shims under a door until it swings true. An index is a quiet promise. I will be found. Neighbors offer memories that weigh more than they look. Mrs. Klein signs an affidavit in her round schoolteacher hand, describing the night I shoveled a path for the ambulance. Mr. Duarte across the alley writes that he has observed Richard performing maintenance and paying for materials, and attaches a faded receipt from the time he borrowed my truck and paid me back in roofing nails. Luke, the boy with the torn sweatshirt now taller than the porch rail, writes a sentence that makes my throat pull tight. He told me the door knew our winters, and I have believed that about people since. Paper can carry tenderness without spilling. I do not call my brother, not once. Silence is a tool. You do not wave it around. He learns of me the way men learn about gravity, by finding the limits of their leap. A week after Rowan files the notice of claim of interest and the petition to quiet title, a junior real estate agent posts a bright flyer that breathes the word exclusive onto our mailbox. 2 days later, the flyer is gone, the agent's number erased from the listing sites because the title company declined to schedule. I see David on the sidewalk saying the word clerical into his phone like it's a name of a god he thinks he can threaten. When Rowan files the list, pendants the formal whisper that there's a dispute attached to the land, she slides the stamped copy across her desk to me. The county seal crumples a little shining circle into the corner. The word means pending suit, but it sounds like something that hangs in the air over a bed when a storm is negotiating with the roof. With that recorded, the house cannot move without me, not on paper. Locks are motion. Deeds are stillness. I feel the stillness settle like a beam set into its pocket. Memory keeps volunteering new exhibits, unbidden and useful. A photograph of me, replacing the porch railing my father's old level, perched like a small spirit on the top board, dated by a newspaper on the steps. A text from David 6 years back. Could you cover the bill? I'll square up Saturday. Saturday never learned to apologize. I print the text and tuck it behind Mrs. Klein's affidavit for company. I do not overbuild. Rowan warned me. Judges prefer clean lines, not barricades. I aim for plumb, not fortress. At night, I practice answers out loud the way you test hinges. Slow, open, close, listen. Yes, Your Honor, I pay the taxes from 2009 through 2024. Yes, I maintain the property as primary caretaker. No, he never contributed to repairs beyond promises. I keep my voice steady in the dark. When your truth is simple, you don't dress it. You present it like a planed board. The grain does the work. David knocks once on my rented door in March, the month that remembers both ice and mud. I do not open. He leaves a note that says, call me. The second note says, we can work something out. The third, you're making this worse. The fourth, you'll be sorry. The progression is a chart of a man running out of charm. I slide the notes into a manila envelope and label it with the date. Rowan will decide whether a judge needs to see them. I need only to remember how quickly tone betrays a strategy. In the courthouse hallway outside the registrar's window, I meet an old notary who has seen more errant signatures than rain. He glances at a photocopy of my brother's affidavit and snorts. Ink isn't magic, he says, tapping the faint stamp with a chewed pencil. People think if they press hard it turns a lie into oak. He shows me, on a blank scrap, the pressure and placement that make a seal clean. The lesson feels like one my father would have given about setting a nail without mushrooming the head. The world is full of men who know how to do small things right. They don't trend, they endure. We sit for deposition prep at Rowan's long table. She teaches me to leave gaps where I don't know, to let silence stand where the truth is sufficient. Don't volunteer, she says. You already gave enough to this house. Let the questions carry their own weight. I learn how to breathe so that answers arrive unpolished. The recorder clicks on, off. My sentences stand like fence posts set in frost, straight, quiet, already part of the landscape. When we finish, Rowan smiles, the smile of someone who has installed a door others will never notice because it swings correctly. A letter arrives addressed to both of us from the county mediator, a polite invitation to resolve. I read it at my tiny kitchen table, sunlight landing on the stamp like approval withheld. Rowan says we will go because judges like men who try before they win. At mediation, David arrives with a new jacket that thinks it's leather and a mouth that thinks it's clever. He opens with, "You never lived there," which is an odd thing to say to the man whose boot prints built the path to the door. Rowan lays the binder on the table. The mediator weighs it with her palms as if judging a melon. The room grows respectful. David offers to buy out my share with an amount that would not purchase the roof's memory of the last storm. I decline without adjective. He gets loud and asks what I want. I tell him, order, acknowledgement, and for the house to stop feeling alone. It is not a legal phrase, but the mediator writes it down and nods the way a person does when a child tells the truth with the wrong vocabulary. We leave without settlement. Outside, the sky is the pale blue of a plan just beginning to believe itself. Rowan files an amended petition that includes new exhibits: the tax ledger, the photographs, the neighbor affidavits, the checks. She adds a request for an accounting every dollar in and out since our mother died. David will hate arithmetic done in front of strangers. I remember him counting on his fingers at the kitchen table while insisting he had a system. Systems matter less than totals. Paper is patient with math. It knows how numbers confess. In April, the title company sends a letter of their own. They will not insure a sale or refinance while the list pendant stands. The sentence is pure metal, cool and sure. I can almost hear the door inside my brother's confidence click shut. He tries the knob and finds out what I did in season 1. Locks speak, but deeds decide. He calls me twice in one afternoon. I watch the phone ring and set the vibrate heartbeat to my pulse. Silence is not revenge. It is respect for the process I chose, for the house that needs paper more than shouting. I visit the church to sand the kneeler my father and I had left with its edges too sharp. Father Mark lets me in with a nod that understands more than he asks. The workshop smells like cedar and beeswax. I round the edge until a sleeve won't catch. I think of my mother's instruction, be kind, and realize kindness here looks like a radius measured with a coin so that kneeling is not a small pain. I sign the underside in pencil, RH, finished what we started. I do not tell anyone. The wood will carry the message to knees that never met me. The judge assigned to our case has a reputation for disliking theatrics. Good. I polish my shoes with a rag that remembers other courthouses where my work spoke instead of me. In the elevator, I study my reflection the way you study a level vial, check the bubble, breathe, set. Rowan's suit is the color of decisive shadows. David's lawyer is new, his tie an argument with the knot. When we stand, the bailiff's voice is a freight train passing. The judge looks like a woman who has taught teenagers and seen worse. We present paper the way builders present trusses. Sequence, spacing, strength. I testify without embroidery. The judge asks how many winters I kept the boiler alive. I say, all of them. She asks if my brother contributed to repairs. I say, not in money or sweat. She asks if I changed the locks. I say, no. David tries a story about de facto control, as if Latin can paint over rot. The judge asks about the notarization. His lawyer says, substantial compliance, and Rowan points to the statute that prefers actual. The word lands with the weight of a plumb bob hitting the bottom of a chalk line. When it ends for the day, we have not won. We have framed the room where winning can stand. Outside, the air smells like thaw and mud, a season that refuses to be rushed. Rowan says the next step is written submissions. She will draft, I will breathe, the house will wait. Waiting is not weakness. It is the discipline by which wood becomes architecture and paper becomes authority. I walk past the square where the old maple keeps the town honest with shade and memory. A crow scolds me. I take it as encouragement. Back in my room, I lay the stamp pleadings on the bedspread. The date in the corner looks like a nailhead you set just right, almost flush, enough to hold. I slip the old brass key from my pocket and set it on top. It no longer opens anything, but it still points one tooth toward the courthouse, another toward the porch, the last toward the place inside me that understands a house is not a prize. It's a promise. The binder is heavy in a satisfying way. In carpentry, weight is confidence. On paper, weight is continuity. Rowan calls at dusk to say the judge granted our motion to record my claim immediately and scheduled a status conference that will feel like a rehearsal for a final. He can't sell, Rowan says, and he can't borrow against it. The road is narrowing. Her voice carries the calm of a person placing the last shim under a stubborn frame. I thank her and hang up and sit very still while the radiator ticks into a new idea of warm. I think of my father's proverb, when a man underestimates you, don't correct him. Documents have done the correcting for me. I write one more note and slide it in the pocket at the back of the binder. Remember to breathe slowly when the stamp comes down. The stamp is the sound I'm chasing now, the thud of recorded, the music of entered, the quiet thunder of title vested. Outside, the town lights up its windows as if answering a roll call. I close the binder, stand, and put on my coat. Tomorrow I will file 2 more affidavits and a photograph of a railing the color of sober promises. Tomorrow I will hold another door for someone and listen to it thank me with hinges that know their winter. The paper trail isn't glamorous. It doesn't satisfy the hunger that wants shouting to feel like justice, but it works. Every page is a board laid across a span I used to jump. Soon I won't need to jump at all. I will walk. And when I reach the porch that pretended to forget me, I won't turn a lock. I will turn a line in the record and let the door remember who built it. The next season will not sound like argument. It will sound like a deed changing hands with the weight of something that belongs where it lands. The first sound that mattered was not a gavel. It was the soft thud of a date stamp on cheap paper, the registrar's hand coming down with the certainty of weather. Before that, there were smaller clicks. The clasp of my binder, the lock on Rowan's briefcase, the way a pen cap announces that someone is done promising and ready to sign. January became February in the manner of paperwork. Nothing obvious from a distance. Everything decisive up close. Rowan drafted. I read, lips moving the way a man tests a hinge before trusting his weight to it. She wrote like a carpenter cuts lines straight. Angle honest. No fancy curves where a square will carry more load. Our filings told the same story, but now with verbs that counted. Paid. Repaired. Maintained. Notified. She stapled exhibits in a sequence that felt like stair risers, steady, predictable, bringing a person from confusion to ground. The judge issued an order I liked more than any speech. Maintain status quo. No transfer, no alteration, no new debt secured by the house while the suit stood breathing. If David had wanted momentum, the order was a hand on his chest. This is good, Rowan said, and slid me the stamped copy. The seal dented the page the way a boot heel writes itself in snow. I ran a thumb over the bulge and felt a part of the house answer in me. We filed more. A motion that asked for partial summary judgment on the simple truths my continuous maintenance and payment. The defective affidavit. The will's expectation. Rowan added a request for an accounting so the numbers would stop pretending to be shy. If he's going to speak in ownership, she said, he can also speak in arithmetic. I did not smile. I sharpened a pencil and labeled new tabs. Taxes, utilities, repairs, affidavits, photos, notes. The binder grew heavier and somehow easier to carry, the way a ladder lightens when you find its balance point in the middle rung. On a raw morning with breath like steam, I went to the tax office and paid what remained of last year's bits and penalties. The clerk printed a certificate of payment and slid it to me with a nod too small to embarrass. The paper still smelled warm from the machine. I folded it once, not twice. Some documents should not be creased into forgetfulness. On my way out, I pressed my palm to the glass of the notice board. Cold met heat. The condensation fogged a fingerprint I didn't wipe away. David left me messages with the rhythms of a man bargaining with gravity. We need to talk. Then, we can solve this. Then, you're ruining things. Then nothing. Silence returns to men who accuse it. Through a neighbor, I heard he'd been telling people the court nonsense would be over soon, and he could finally sell. The title company's letter saying no had reached him like a closed door. Ordinary, firm, uninterested in his voice. We prepared for the hearing on our motion. Rowan and I sat at her long oak table. The grain beneath my fingertips looked like river shallows, the easy part where rocks show you how water thinks. They'll argue substantial compliance, she said, tapping the crooked notary stamp on the affidavit that pretended to give David control. We'll argue actual, and we'll argue equity. Who paid, who cared, who built the continuity. She showed me the case's short names, long consequences, equitable contribution, resulting trust, constructive trust. Arid phrases that nonetheless watered dry ground. The day of the hearing, the courthouse halls smelled like damp wool and coffee. People lined benches with nervous knees. When our case was called, I stood not to impress anyone, but because the body understands when it is time to carry its own spine. David came in with a smile that mistook charm for argument. He wore a new jacket with a shine that wanted to be leather and a tie that wanted to be forgiven. His lawyer looked as if he had borrowed his confidence from a magazine. Rowan spoke first quiet, factual, a litany of ordinary labor. She held up photographs. The railing I rebuilt, the boiler I nursed into one more winter, the roof line finally true after a season of tar and patience. She moved to receipts, checks, ledgers. Each item was a board she laid from one pier to the next, and I watched the bridge appear under the judge's eyes. David's lawyer tried to detour into feeling, my client believes, my client always intended, but belief without lumber doesn't span a creek and flood. The judge asked about the defective notarization, the missing line listing other interested parties, the will's expectation. When he said expectation, he gave it the weight of a nail you pound once and leave forever. We did not win that morning. The judge took the motion under advisement the way a careful man examines a beam before letting his children walk across it. But I saw a change I trusted. The judge's posture when he looked at the timeline, the slight tilt forward at the mention of quiet title, the way his raised eyebrows smoothed when Rowan cited a case where years of maintenance and payment ripened into actual authority. Before we left, he set a further status conference and asked both counsel about willingness to explore settlement. Rowan said yes without eagerness. David's lawyer said yes with relief. In the hallway afterward, I leaned against a window and felt March give up a little of its winter. David came close enough to smell his aftershave and asked, like a man who still believes he owns the volume knob, "What do you want, Rich?" I looked at him the way you look at a miscut board measuring for salvage. "Order," I said. "And for the house to stop feeling alone." He laughed. "Houses don't feel." I didn't answer. I let the silence say, "Yours doesn't." Mediation this time didn't sputter. The mediator hair like steel wool, voice like a calm line level said the word accounting enough times to drain David's face. Rowan spread the ledger pages and ran a fingertip down columns where my name was a metronome. "He owes you," the mediator said, "not to me, but to the room itself." David tried to count on pride. Pride lost its place. "What if," he stammered, "what if I pay some and we keep it 50-50? Rowan slid forward a typed term sheet. Quit claim to Richard. Richard waives personal accounting and pays a modest relocation allowance within 30 days. Stipulated judgment quieting title. Mutual non-disparagement. The mediator's pen hovered. "This is clean," she said. "This is merciful," I thought, and kept my mouth shut. David refused on Tuesday. He offered again on Thursday. By Friday, he wanted time to think, as if arithmetic rests. Saturday, he called me 5 times. I didn't pick up. Sunday after church, Father Mark nodded at me in the parking lot, like a man spotting a beam set straight from a long way off. Monday morning, David arrived at Rowan's office 20 minutes early, carrying his impatience in a paper cup. We went into the conference room with windows that made winter look like someone else's problem. The notary set a blue pad on the table and tested her stamp on a sticky note, as if to remind the room that ink has standards. Rowan read the terms aloud. David stopped her twice to ask if we could add a sentence about how this was mutual. Rowan pointed to mutual non-disparagement and went on. When it came time to sign, David's pen scratched like a small animal trying to escape. The notary took her time. ID, oath, date, seal, place level, and whole no half kiss of a stamp this time. No crowding the county line. The embossment shadow looked like a tiny mountain range at dusk. I initialed where I was told. My name, Richard Hale, looked ordinary and solid where it landed. We escorted the deed across town like a simple truth on a careful walk. The registrar's office hummed with the unglamorous dignity of filing. A mother filled out a birth certificate in the corner. A man asked about a fishing license at the wrong window and was kindly redirected. We stepped to the counter. Rowan slid the quitclaim deed and the stipulated judgment forward. The clerk, a woman whose hair had been every color once and had settled on gray, read fast and frowned only where people usually lie. She didn't find it. "What's the rush?" she asked as she stamped the first page, the second, the last. "It's been rushing toward this for years," I said. She smiled the way strangers do when a sentence lands plumb. The scanner hummed, swallowed the deed, and spit out an image with an instrument number and a timestamp, exact enough to tell you the minute it became true. The clerk slid a certified copy toward me. "You'll want to keep this somewhere dry," she said. "It already is," I replied, and folded it once, not twice. I walked back out into the square with the paper warm through the envelope. and the old brass key warming the crease of my palm. If a man can hear a house from a block away, I did. Not boards, not pipes, the idea of it. Standing, relieved, like a chest after a cough ends. I didn't head there yet. There were courtesies to do right. Rowan emailed a copy to the judge and the mediator, and filed the stipulation, so the list pendants could be released not because the fight collapsed, but because the fight had been built into a deed. She shook my hand with the firmness of a person who trusts wood more than talk. No victory lap, she said. Just next steps. I'm a man of steps, I said, and we both believed it. I sent David a short message through Rowan, a date by which he should gather his personal belongings and a time I would be there with a locksmith not to bar him, but to begin again. She wrote it in courteous sentences that left no room for flinching. I included an offer of 2 weeks' storage in the garage I had kept dry except during storms that arrived uninvited. Mercy without structure is just softness. I prefer mercy that can hold weight. On the day, I arrived early and sat in my truck with the engine off, watching breath make ghosts. The locksmith pulled up a woman in her 30s with forearms like useful lumber and a smile that said she'd seen worse doors. Old mortise lock? She asked, pushing her toolbox onto the porch. Older than some promises, I said. Let's keep the hardware if we can, she replied, and my chest loosened. I prefer original, I said. She showed me a set of pins and springs on a velvet tray, parts arranged with the neatness of someone who believes order is a language. David came 20 minutes late, dragging a box that rattled like empty plans. He didn't look at me. He went to the living room and stood where our mother used to rest in the afternoons when summer settled under her bones. He touched the window I had once taped for her and said to no one, "It's smaller than I remembered." That is what happens when you stand at the edge of consequence. Walls recover their true dimensions. We worked without talking much. He took a framed poster that had hung where my father's map belonged and a set of golf clubs I never saw him use. He left behind a stack of real estate magazines harboring staged kitchens and lives that smelled faintly of lemons nobody squeezed. The locksmith hummed while she matched brass to brass, respectful of the old plate, gentle with a cylinder that had learned other songs too recently. When she handed me the new keys, they were the same shape as the old, and they weighed more. Memory adds metal. David paused at the doorway holding a shoebox, the last thing. He looked at me the way a boy looks over the edge of a dock, assessing water that won't change to suit him. "You always thought you loved it more than me," he said. I shook my head. I acted like I did. He blinked. The truth did not insult him. It filtered. When he left, the door settled on its hinges with a sound like a good sentence ending. The locksmith tested the latch a final time, turned the knob with the show of a magician, revealing nothing but mechanism. "It'll hold," she said. "It already did," I answered, and paid her in cash that looked larger leaving my hand than it had when it arrived there this morning. She tucked the bills away, nodded to the house as if it had thanked her, and drove off. I walked room to room and listened to how space remembers footsteps. Dust motes lifted in the winter sun and drifted the way flour does when you have not yet added water. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet where my mother kept the folding board and found the small notch my father cut to keep the hinge from binding. I pressed my thumb there. I do not tell you what I felt because words like relief and home and justice compete when they should stand politely and let the quiet pass. Then I went to the garage. The kneeler my father and I had finished rested along the wall like a boat on blocks. I set it on the workbench and checked the radius I had softened months ago. No sleeve would catch now. I brushed away a cobweb with the back of my hand and oiled the rag I keep in a coffee can. The smell of linseed climbed the air like a slow hymn. My father's level lay in its place, the bubble fat and green, patient as always. That evening, I sat on the porch with the certified copy of the deed on my knee. The sun slid between the branches of the old maple and turned the paper thin amber. Somewhere down the block, a child laughed with the authority of someone to whom locks are still a puzzle and doors are still promises. I put the paper back in its envelope and slid the old brass key from my pocket. It did not fit the repin lock now. That was good. The new key did, and it lay beside the old like a younger brother who had finally learned better posture. There is a dignity in not peacocking your victories. The next day, I swept the porch, tacked a loose clapboard, and rehung the bell that used to call us to dinner. I didn't tell anyone. The house told the truth if you stood close enough. Lines trued, paint touched, hinge oil convincing a squeak to try kindness. I kept the windows bare for a week to let light examine every corner for the kind of neglect that can masquerade as style. It found little. I found peace you have to earn board by board. Rowan sent me the court's entered stipulated judgment quieting title with a subject line that did not brag. The order said what an order should say. Who owns, what is recorded, which cloud has been burned off, and by whose son. I printed it and placed it behind the deed, then wrote a note on a small card and tucked it in the very back pocket of the binder. The house is not alone. No one will read that. It isn't for reading. At dusk, I locked the door, not because I feared, but because doors crave routine. I put the keys in my pocket and felt their shape the way a man recognizes his own handwriting in the dark. Down the street, porch lights woke one by one like polite constellations. The maple fretted, then settled. In the garage, the tools remembered their names. The turn of the deed had already happened in me long before the stamp fell. But paper is how towns keep score. Now the record and I agreed. I slept that night in the rented room above the hardware store, not because I had to, but because endings deserve one more courteous bow before you start the next act. The radiator ticked. The binder sat on the chair, fat and content. I set the old key on top of it and the new key under my pillow, and in that arrangement there was no triumph, only alignment. Tomorrow I will go home. And then the season of another man's pretending will begin to end. The first night back in the house, I slept like a man who'd been holding a plank in freezing water and finally climbed onto the dock. I woke before dawn, the room blew with patience, and listened to the radiators whisper the old syllables. Pipes clear their throats the same way men do when they're about to tell the truth. I lay still long enough to hear the maple rub its fingers together against the eaves. The air smelled faintly of dust, linseed, and something else hope, if hope had a scent. Downfall never arrives with trumpets. It shows up in envelopes, in neighbors' eyes. In the quiet way, a town decides what it knows. For David, it began with the silence where a sale should have been, then the way people stopped repeating his version of the story and started using mine without credit. I did nothing extra. I let the paper speak, and the house do the rest. In the kitchen, I boiled coffee on the old stovetop and rinsed the mug my mother had insisted was too chipped to throw away. I took it out to the porch and watched the street uncurl. Mrs. Klein waved from across the way, the gesture tidy, as if she were underlining a sentence. She came over with a plate of rolls that carried warm like a secret. I figured the first morning ought to smell like cinnamon, she said. On the plate's foil lid, she'd written in small teacher script, "Welcome home, Richard." There was no performance in it, only accuracy. David called that afternoon, not to congratulate, not to apologize, but to ask if I had seen a magazine subscription he'd paid for that still arrived at the house. "I'll leave it on the porch," I said. "You can pick it up." He arrived after dusk, stood on the steps, and stared through me toward the hallway as if he could still order it to remember him differently. "You changed the locks," he said, with a tone that mistook astonishment for grievance. "I repinned them," I answered. "The old brass plates are intact." He blinked at brass plates as if the words didn't know where to sit in his mind. "Right," he said. "Well." He left with the magazine under his arm, a glossy fiction about kitchens that can be bought. Neighbors began returning small things he'd borrowed and stacked in the wrong corners of their lives. A rake leaned against my fence with a note, "Think this belongs to your father's shed." A folding chair appeared like a shrug beside the side door. Someone set a jar of mismatched screws on the porch rail with a rubber band around the lid, as if to keep them from speaking out of turn. The town was redistributing memory to the place that could hold it. Rowan sent a short message. "Judge entered final judgment. Copy attached for your binder. Title quieted. Case closed." Those 4 sentences weighed like a beam. I printed 2 copies. One went behind the deed. The other went in the drawer where my father kept the checkbook under the rubber-banded stash of spare keys, and a handful of pennies flattened by trains, and the letter he once wrote after his stroke. I put the drawer back gently, the runners complaining in a familiar rhythm, and made a note to wax them into kindness. Now that the house had stopped bracing for a stranger's footsteps, it started articulating its needs. The upstairs east window took on a stutter when opened. The pantry shelf sagged as if embarrassed by its own loyalty. Nothing urgent, everything honest. I made a yellow pad list and began at the back door, the way you start sanding at the far end of a plank so the dust falls forward, not back. A man who wins quietly should repair quietly. I oiled, shimmed, tightened, and left no note about it anywhere. Results know how to keep their own minutes. The town's gossip, which had once been David's climate control, cooled. It is difficult to maintain a temperature on talk when the record refuses to hug your story. I heard, through the people who can't help narrating, that he'd tried to position the outcome as a mutual decision to avoid legal waste. Then, someone brought up the notary who took her time. Someone else mentioned the list pendants. Someone remembered seeing me on ladders in hail. It's hard to build a scaffold of lies when the walls don't offer anchor points. His girlfriend, the one who once laughed on my porch at jokes that evaporated with her breath, came by one afternoon while I was scraping paint from the screen door. She stood on the walk like someone who has accidentally arrived at a library. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, not looking quite at me, not quite at the door. "I didn't understand it was like this." She gestured vaguely toward the house, which is to say toward the work. "Most people don't," I said. She nodded, then asked if David could pick up a box of things he'd forgotten. "He can," I said. "I'll set it aside." She left with her apology folded small, like a note passed in a schoolroom and never read aloud. Money has a way of telling the truth in letters banks send when charm expires. One afternoon, a notice with his name blew from the wrong mailbox to my porch. I walked it next door. The envelope was thin, the way bad news is when lawyers aren't involved yet. Adverse action, the heading said, which is how institutions define no. When I handed it to him at the threshold of his rented apartment, he glanced at the return address and then at me like a man trying to decide which angle of a mirror is lying. "Thanks," he said. He held the door closed, a body's way of saying the furniture inside is not ready for witnesses. I stopped walking the long way around our block. I took the direct route again, past the square, past the bench where I had once rested the binder against ribs braced for winter. The courthouse steps had scuffed a little more. A new mother carried a baby that did not know yet how towns keep balance. I lifted my hand to the clerk through the window, and she lifted hers back. A wave, you say, for people whose paperwork broke your heart a little less than usual. Within, I did what men do when they inherit the present. I cleaned. The living room had absorbed voices that did not ask permission. I opened both windows and let January's end pull those vowels out by the edges. I scrubbed the baseboards where my boy hand had carved initials behind the bookshelf. The nick was still there, shy and proud at once. I touched it with a rag and it refused to leave. Good. Some marks should outlast all facelifts. When the mail started arriving in my name again, it came with echoes. The church sent a bulletin with a penciled note from Father Mark. "Neeler looks finished." The hardware store tucked a coupon into a catalog and scrawled "Welcome back" above our aisle 3. The tax office sent a new statement stamped "Paid." Paper is not sentimental, but it keeps better company once it has been convinced. David's downfall did not look like a man tripping. It looked like a man forced to sit with arithmetic. When he tried to rent a larger place and floated his income on anticipated commissions, someone asked for proof. When he tried to borrow against furniture as if it were heirloom, someone asked what heir. He stopped speaking loudly at the bar where he used to rehearse his opinions. He moved to a stool near the door and watched other people's stories walk in. More than once, I stood at the end of the aisle in the grocery and saw him reading labels, like a person doing math, to avoid shame unit prices, discounts, a private ledger that would not permit beer and steak on the same receipt. None of this pleased me. It pleased something small and cruel that I kept on a leash and fed nothing. Vengeance is a dog that eats your hand if you offer it the wrong scraps. I kept to what I'd chosen. Order, acknowledgement, an end to loneliness for the house, and, if there was any grace left, for me. When people tried to tell me how badly he was doing, I changed the subject to weather or the baseball season that would come and pretend to be about hope. I invited exactly 3 people to coffee the first Saturday: Mrs. Klein, Mr. Duarte, and Luke the boy who believed doors had winters. We sat at the table my father had refinished twice and watched sunlight play with steam from mugs. We said very little. Mr. Duarte brought a bag of roofing nails, just in case. Mrs. Klein slid me a copy of the affidavit she'd given Rowan. She had placed it in a plastic sleeve and labeled it as if to teach a unit on civics that matters. Luke asked if I'd show him how to set a hinge so a door closes itself. An old trick grandfathered in from houses that care about where people end their day. I said yes. Teaching is a way of paying debts you don't want to collect. The locksmith returned midweek to adjust the strike plate. She said would settle once the house remembered who it was. She looked around and smiled at the quiet. "Sounds right," she said. I handed her back the velvet tray and told her I'd kept the old pins, just in case memory needed a talisman. She laughed and said, "You're the only client who keeps hardware like rosary beads." Maybe I do. Maybe prayer is just the discipline of touching the same honest shapes in the same honest order. The social part of downfall arrived like frost. People stopped asking David about plans and began asking him about errands. He carried other folks' small packages from the post office and returned borrowed ladders with polite texts that didn't pretend he'd use them. His girlfriend X, I suppose, took a job in a shop that smells like candles and forgiveness. She nodded when I walked by. Sinners recognize each other, saints live elsewhere. One night, just after the dinner hour when the neighborhood chooses between dishes and dishes, David rang the bell on my porch. The sound hopped down the hallway like a bird looking for crumbs. I opened the door and leaned against it, the way men do when they want to keep bone honest. He had a thin envelope in his hand and an expression that hadn't learned its part. "This was in my mailbox," he said. "Looks official." He handed me the envelope. County seal. Inside, a stamped copy of the recorded judgment. "They send both parties," I said. "You could keep it for your records." He looked past me into the house without intruding and nodded. "I'll keep the letter," he said, so I remember how this worked out. He didn't spit the words. He didn't sugar them either. He stood a long moment, then added, "I thought winning would feel different. I wanted to say so did I. Instead, I said, this isn't winning, it's restoring." He thought about that, as if restoration might be a kind of victory he could believe in if the mirror would cooperate. When he left, I set the county's copy in a drawer with the spare keys, beside the pennies pressed flat and the letter my father wrote. The drawer closed smoother than the week before. Wax behaves kindly when you insist. Work continued, the holy variety, recaulking the tub, mending a plaster welt above the stove, sanding 2 balusters until the hand preferred them. I salvaged a scrap of cedar from the garage and carved a small plaque for the kneeler underside, finished with patience. It isn't for the faithful. It is for the knees that will not know me except by relief. On a Tuesday that smelled like rain deciding, I saw David in the square talking to a boy with a resume in his hand. He pointed the kid toward the library bulletin board and said something that made the boy straighten his shoulders instead of his jaw. He caught me watching and offered a small salute with 2 fingers. I returned it. Some men learned the right lessons late. Late is still allowed. A letter from the bank arrived addressed to me, offering refinance terms I did not need. I ran my thumb under the flap, read 2 paragraphs of flattery, and dropped it into the drawer with the coupons. I prefer the mortgage of maintenance. Pay with sandpaper and oil. Earn equity by tightening a hinge in February when no one is there to clap. Interest on that note compounds in sleep and the sound of the house answering you when you ask it politely to bear your weight. In April, when small green things pretend bravery, I took the old rope from the shed and hung a swing from the maple. I climbed the ladder and tied the knots my hands remembered better than my brain. The first test applying my own weight to uncertainty held. The second test letting a neighbor's child try it sang. He swung, whooped, and aimed his toes at a sky that had no opinion about deeds. His mother cried quietly. In that way mothers do when past and present finally agree for 1 second. "We always wanted that back," she said. "Me too," I answered. When evening fell, the porch gathered the smells of cut grass and wet soil. I sat with my notebook and wrote small sentences that didn't need to be read by anyone else. I listed today's repairs. I recorded the weather in the language my father preferred, a good wind for drying clothes. I wrote a line I have never said aloud. I forgive him. I do not mean it like absolution. I mean it like removing a nail from a board, so the wood stops splitting around something that doesn't belong there. Forgiveness is a carpentry skill that has nothing to do with forgetting, and everything to do with not letting rot spread. The last piece of David's downfall happened the way end credits do. Quietly, after most people have stood up to find their coats. At the mediation follow-up, the mediator closed the file and said, "I wish more brothers ended here." He nodded. "Me too," he said. And then, more like a question, "Am I done?" The mediator smiled. "With this," she said, "with this." He signed the final receipt for the small relocation allowance I had promised months before, and did not try to turn it into a victory. He folded it into his wallet like a lesson, and I hoped it would stay there longer than cash. I walked home without stopping by the square. The house had the porch light on, not because I'd set a timer, but because I had developed the habit of remembering my own arrival. Habits are the opposite of drama. They are justice's daily close. I unlocked the door and immediately locked it again, to let the latch learn the rhythm of my hands. The keys settled in my pocket the way coins do when you know where they came from. Downfall, it turns out, doesn't look like ruin. It looks like recalibration. David started saying, "I used to live there instead of my house." He started telling a version of the story where we both made choices and the court blessed patience. It isn't wholly accurate, but it is closer to okay than the one he started with. In a small town, that counts as learning. He nods now when we pass. Once he stopped near the maple and watched the rope swing burn a fine groove in July air. "We had one like that," he said. "We do again," I answered. At night when the house settles, I tour it with my ears the way my father taught. One slow pass to hear pipes, one to hear wood, one to hear wind. The radiators cluck, the steps sigh, the windows offer polite complaints that ask for spring. I make small promises in the dark, the kind I keep. I'll reglaze you next week. I'll oil that hinge. I'll sand the lip where the broom catches. Commitment spoken to rooms turn into rest inside the man who speaks them. On the dresser, the certified copy of the deed rests under the old brass key. The new key sleeps in the dish by the door, nicked already from honest use. I do not touch the paper every day. I don't need to. The walls remind me, the floors nod. The town has filed its own quiet title inside the way it speaks my name again when it points at the house. Not as a question, not as a rumor, but as a fact. Tomorrow I'll rake the side yard and find the marbles we lost there 40 years ago. Tomorrow I'll show Luke how to float a door so it closes itself with a whisper. Tomorrow I'll take the binder from the shelf and put it deeper away. Not because I will ever forget the work it did, but because justice that has settled doesn't need to perform. And then, with the maple flicking shadows onto the porch and the bell ready to call a man back for supper, I'll stand at the threshold a long second and pat my pocket, feeling the shape of what is mine, and what I held onto without shouting before I step inside and let the door close on the right side of history. The house did not cheer when it became mine again. It exhaled. Wood has lungs of its own, and plaster holds its breath when frightened. That spring, when the title was no longer clouded, the floors relaxed beneath me as if relieved to be walked upon without argument. Every board in that place had listened to me longer than my brother ever had. Now they recognized my boots again. I kept the certified deed in a file drawer beside insurance papers and my father's will. It was just ink on a page, but whenever I opened that drawer, I smelled a faint note of iron paper and metal, promise and key. The courthouse seal had dented the page with authority, but it was the weight in my pocket that carried more truth. The keys rattled each time I bent, like a pocket watch reminding me time has edges. The first morning after the judgment, I brewed coffee, carried it to the porch, and watched the neighborhood wake. Curtains lifted in windows. A dog barked at its own shadow. Mrs. Klein came out to collect her paper and raised a hand as if nothing had ever been unsettled. In small towns, once paper is recorded, memory decides to agree. The maple tree shaded the swing I had hung for the children. A boy with shoelaces untied tested it, squealing when the rope caught his weight. His mother mouthed thank you across the yard. I raised my mug in answer. Inside, I opened drawers and closets. Some were filled with objects my brother had left behind a broken lamp, catalogs that expired before their promises, a jacket that smelled faintly of smoke. I boxed them, taped the flaps, and stacked them by the door. One evening, when the street was quiet, I carried the boxes to his apartment. I didn't knock. I left them on the stoop and walked away. That was the last delivery I owed him. Restoration became my prayer. Each repair whispered to me more than sermons could. I reglazed the upstairs windows, smoothing putty until it held the glass like a steady hand. I planed the pantry door until it closed without complaint. I rebuilt the garden gate my mother once leaned on while shelling peas. The rhythm of sanding, oiling, hammering was steadier than any revenge. Revenge is fire. Repair is water. I let the water carry me. Some nights I would walk through each room, touching lintels and knobs, hearing their answers. Wood can answer if you stand still. David did not vanish. He shrank. Neighbors said he moved from one rental to another, each smaller, each less ambitious. I saw him sometimes in the grocery store, counting coupons, his cart filled with plain pasta and cans. He would spot me, nod once, and move on. No more swagger, no more announcements. Just a man reduced to receipts. Once, he stopped me outside the post office. His voice was low, almost hoarse. You got what you wanted. I shook my head. I got what was owed. He studied the ground, scuffing his shoe on the curb. Does it feel good? I looked at the envelope in my hand, the deed's duplicate copy, sent as confirmation from the clerk. It feels finished. He nodded. His mouth twisted, not in anger, but in something smaller. Regret, perhaps, or hunger. Then he walked away. That was his downfall, not scandal, not spectacle, but the slow recognition that his voice no longer bent the air. The house began returning memory in pieces. Behind a loose baseboard in the upstairs hall, I found marbles I had lost as a boy, dust-fogged but still glassy. In the attic, I uncovered a crate of old hymnals my mother had saved. The pages smelled of mildew and lemon oil, a contradiction I loved. In the garage rafters, I found my father's level, still straight after years of neglect. Each object testified quietly. They didn't cheer, they didn't accuse. They simply existed, proof that my presence had been continuous, even when my brother tried to erase it. Towns issue verdicts differently than courts, not with stamps, but with conversation. At the diner, men nodded at me when I walked in, as if the coffee pot itself had ruled in my favor. At church, Father Mark thanked me for finishing the kneeler and mentioned it during a sermon about perseverance. At the hardware store, the clerk gave me a discount without comment, the kind of gesture that says, we know who carried the weight. No one mentioned my brother much anymore. When they did, it was in past tense, as if he were a season that had passed. I still kept the old brass key, though it no longer fit the lock. I carried it in the same pocket as the new one. The two keys tapped against each other like an old man clearing his throat to make room for his son's voice. The old key was scarred, edges nicked from decades of use. The new one was sharp, brass still bright. But both carried the same teeth, the pattern of belonging. One represented memory, the other, authority. Together they reminded me, you endured long enough to earn both. Sometimes at night, I'd set the old key on the windowsill and watch it gleam in moonlight. I never let it gather dust. It was my proof that locks change, but roots don't. Months later, David came again. He didn't knock, he rang the bell politely, waiting until I opened. He carried nothing but a folded envelope. I wanted you to have this, he said, handing it to me. Inside was the last bill for utilities he had paid before the court intervened. A small amount printed in faded ink. On the margin he had scrawled, "That one was mine." I looked at him and nodded. Yes, it was. He waited, perhaps for argument, perhaps for kindness. I gave him neither, just acknowledgement. Then he left, his footsteps soft on the porch I had rebuilt. That night, I placed the bill in the binder with everything else. A record deserves completeness, even of small debts. Spring leaned into summer. I painted the shutters green, the shade my mother preferred. I trimmed the hedges until the front walk looked like a sentence finally punctuated. I planted tomatoes in the back, remembering how my father used to stake them with scrap lumber. Neighbors stopped by, not to congratulate, but to belong. Luke, the boy who once believed doors knew winters, helped me reset a sagging fence post. He asked, "Does it feel like revenge?" I told him, "It feels like care." He didn't answer, but his nod told me he understood. One evening, I sat at the dining table alone, a plate of bread, cheese, and apples before me. The house hummed. Outside, the swing creaked under a child's laughter. I thought of my parents, of my father's steady hands, my mother's whispered instruction, "Be kind." I thought of all the winters I carried the place like a secret burden. I thought of David, reduced but still breathing somewhere beyond these walls. And I thought of the keys in my pocket, metal proof that silence is not weakness. It is patience armed with time. The house will outlast me. One day someone else will argue with his plumbing, laugh at his squeaky stair, curse his drafty window. I hope they will also feel the warmth in its bones, the accumulation of care that doesn't make headlines. But for now, it is mine, quietly, firmly, legally, spiritually. I walked the rooms once more before bed, turning off lights, locking doors. Each click of the lock echoed like a benediction. Finally, I slid the new key into my pocket beside the old one. The weight balanced, as if time itself had settled. I whispered into the dark hallway, not for anyone but the house, "You are not alone." And in the hush that followed, I swear the house answered back,